Carefully gathering the scattered candies from the floor with trembling hands, Mrs. Oksana expressed dissatisfaction. "What kind of bags are these? They can't even hold a handful of candies," she grumbled. "Grandma, let me help," a young woman said. Mrs. Oksana straightened up and saw a short, slightly overweight young woman with a disproportionately large belly, resembling more of a pregnant woman. She had light hair and was dressed plainly but neatly. "I've gathered them already." "Thank you," Mrs. Oksana said. "The bags nowadays, they tear at the slightest touch." The old lady showed the bag to the woman as proof and shook it. Mrs. Oksana didn't see anything wrong with the stranger, so she struck up a conversation. In response, the woman attentively listened to the grandmother, helped her out of the store, offered to carry the bag, and as soon as the old lady transferred the handles of her cloth bag to the stranger's hands, she hurried off. She didn't run fast though, more like a chicken waddling from side to side. Mrs. Oksana just gasped. "Help! My bag's been torn," she finally shouted. But the woman had already disappeared around the corner. Mrs. Oksana stood there with her arms crossed over her chest, everyone passing by, no one paying attention to her. Mrs. Oksana reached the corner, her bag lying on the road, everyone avoiding it. The old lady shuffled to the bag, picked it up, and shook it. Everything was in place: bread, milk, and candies. "What's happening to me?" the woman scolded loudly. Mrs. Oksana always kept her small purse tucked into the pocket sewn on her chest, covering it carefully with the blouse she wore in summer. In winter, she kept the money in the inner pocket of her coat. "Dear Grandma, forgive me, I threw your bag," the woman with the belly shouted, returning to the old lady. "Someone stole my suitcase. I attached it to the rails near the store. We walked out, I see the suitcase is gone, and there's some guy dragging it behind the house." And the woman pointed her finger towards a parallel street. She caught up. "And where is it now?" The woman pressed her fist against her nose, trying to hide her emotions and the tears welling up, clutching her lower abdomen. "And it looked like he was a short guy, in funny red pants, like bloomers. That was Boris. Let's go." The old lady briskly walked ahead, showing the way. Several streets later, the women turned into a private sector. The grandmother approached the gate of one of the old, overgrown with grass and bushes houses, and shouted loudly, "Maria!" The windows of the old house opened, and a disheveled woman with a bruise under her left eye looked out. "Maria, tell Boris to give back the suitcase, or I'll call the police on to Mafi right away." "No, Boris is at home, Mrs. Oksana," the woman replied and disappeared. "Maria, I'm already calling to Mafi." The grandmother briskly pulled out her phone from the inner pocket and held her hand up so that it was visible from inside the house, signaling her seriousness. Sounds came from the side of the house, the gate opened, and Maria rolled out a yellow suitcase. "Take it, what are you waiting for?" Mrs. Oksana pointed at the suitcase. "It's not mine," the woman replied fearfully. "Maria, don't make me angry," the grandmother frowned. Maria disappeared into the yard, there was some commotion, and then she rolled out a small black suitcase through the open door. "Mine," the woman rejoiced and grabbed the handle. Maria closed the door, and the women stood outside the house. "That Boris, he's quite something. Don't be upset with him." "Where were you headed?" "Just arrived?" "Our village is small, I know almost everyone, haven't seen you," the grandmother inquired. "I just arrived from the station, thought I'd buy some water, and then all these adventures happened." The woman pulled out a folded paper, unfolded it, and read. "Cherry Street, House 29, can you tell me where that is?" Mrs. Oksana was noticeably surprised, her hands shook again from excitement, it suddenly felt hot, and she loosened the knot of her scarf slightly. "Who are you visiting?" "A relative of mine lives there," the woman replied. Mrs. Oksana was even more surprised, she carefully examined the woman's face again, trying hard to find any hint in her memory. "Let's go, I'll walk you along the way." The woman was pleased, grabbed the suitcase, and they strolled along the road at a leisurely pace. "What's your name?" Did you tell me? I forgot, Mrs. Oksana asked. I didn't tell you, I'm Vera, the woman replied and looked at the grandmother, expecting her to introduce herself in return. But the grandmother was lost in her own thoughts, slowly tapping her foot. She stopped in front of one of the houses, opened the gate, and said, "Well, come in since you're here." The woman looked a bit confused and glanced at the house, noticing a sign on the fence indicating Cherry Street and house number 29. So, you're Mrs. Oksana? Dara exclaimed, unable to hide her joy. Yes, that's me, confirmed the grandmother, waving her hand. Come on in. Mrs. Oksana put the kettle on to boil, took out bread and milk from her bag, placed them in the fridge, leisurely poured tea into cups, topped up the teapot with boiling water, set a plate of cookies in the middle of the table, and finally sat opposite Vera. Well, Vera, I think this conversation will be lengthy. Tell me, I'll listen attentively, Vera replied. Oh, Mrs. Oksana, I'm your daughter, Vera began. Who? The grandmother tore her gaze away from the cup and looked at the stranger. Your daughter. Well, technically, I'm Mikhail's daughter. Your husband's. Your stepdaughter, I suppose. When my mother became an alcoholic, my father took me in, and I lived with him for 7 years. I found out from my father that he had a first wife, but he didn't tell me anything else. Mrs. Oksana paused for a moment, clearly taken aback by this news, but then she composed herself and asked the question that worried her the most. I don't understand. Why did you come to me? Vera smiled contentedly and pulled out some papers from her bag. My father left a will with me. The apartment I currently live in was bought during my marriage with you. Here are the documents, and there's a note with your address. Why did you come to me, though? It's strange. What if I had moved? The grandmother repeated her question. You would have waited until I'm gone and lived peacefully as the heir. Mrs. Oksana knowingly said the last sentence to gauge Vera's reaction. Vera noticeably grew sad. Why are you like this? I still bear my mother's surname. A child will be born, and I'll need to register it. And just the other day, the management company asked to sign a contract. I decided to look at the documents, and there not only is Dad listed as the owner, I began to get confused about the facts. The woman, probably eager to lay out as many of her pressing questions as possible, replied. Mikhail took that apartment, this house, at that time, so to speak. As compensation. Once we agreed, and I had no intention of making claims. I didn't know about you, and nobody told me that he didn't transfer the documents to his name. It's been over 20 years, and nobody informed me of his absence either, Mrs. Oksana countered. According to your agreement with him, it might be so, but the paperwork says otherwise. I have no rights, and I didn't know where to report, didn't know the phone number. Dara put on a pained expression, and the grandmother couldn't help but feel sorry for her. It was evident that she was good-hearted, just as simple and unassuming as her father. Mrs. Oksana looked at the woman again, but her expression remained unchanged. Oh, Vera said, I think I'm in labor. Where's my phone? Mrs. Oksana exclaimed anxiously. Patience, dear, I'll call the doctor now, Vera reassured her. 3 days later, Vera and her daughter were discharged from the hospital, and Vera's husband came to pick them up. Throughout those 3 days, Mrs. Oksana called and inquired about the well-being of the mother and the newborn. She also came for the discharge. She stood aside. The doors of the ward cheerfully swung open, pushing out new people in blue, pink, and cream-colored bundles. Mrs. Oksana felt tears welling up in her eyes. She had never walked through those doors, never stood on the steps, and now, in her old age, such an event. Even if not her own blood, even if Mikhail's daughter, but at least a little joy in this bleak life. Mrs. Oksana! Dara shouted and waved her hand. While the nurse handed the new father a pink envelope, the woman began to descend the stairs and continued waving to the grandmother. I'm so glad you came. Thank you for everything, Dara exclaimed. Mrs. Oksana approached closer. This is Artem, my husband, she introduced the man. Perhaps we could go to my place? It's a bit hard to travel with the baby. You can rest, and then we'll set off, Hopefully, she asked. That would be nice. I just got off the bus, the man replied. Then let's go, the grandmother rejoiced. Look, Mrs. Oksana, she's as fair as her grandfather. Dara lifted the blanket slightly and showed the baby's head in a little cap, under which white hair could be seen. The grandmother looked with interest at the newborn, gently touched her rosy forehead, and smiled. On the way home, she met a neighbor to whom 3 days ago, when asked who was taken away in an ambulance, she had replied that it was her stepdaughter. The woman smiled, suddenly becoming a mother and a grandmother in an instant.